Welcome, everyone. I am Eva Sain, the Wellness Director here at the NewCanaanYMCA, and we are so excited that you are joining us for our ForeverWell virtual cooking class with Ronnie. I've had the privilege of tasting Ronnie's cooking on many occasions, and she never disappoints. Ronnie, the floor is yours, and have fun, everyone.
Okay, thank you for asking me to do this. I'm delighted, and I love teaching cooking, so any questions that you have, I'd be glad to answer them. We're making what I call a winter into spring soup that involves peppers. Winter because it's a soup, but peppers because they're sweet and they're spring-like. The soup is kind of light. So this is really an any season kind of soup. If you look at your recipe, I think everybody has the recipe. I asked for 5 to 6 sweet red peppers, which means not green peppers, because green peppers are kind of harsh. So when I say 5 or 6, it's because peppers come in different sizes. This is a very large one, and this is what I would call a sort of medium to small. This is even smaller, so use your judgment. If you're using 6 of these, it's going to be a lot. If you're using 6 of these, it's going to be a lot. So you want about 5 or 6 of peppers. And I know I said red, but now we can get orange, yellow. You can mix it up. The only thing that makes a difference is the color variation. And in addition, if you like snappy, jazzy, fiery, spicy soup, you can add one of these. This is a jalapeno, but you could use a serrano pepper, you could use habanero pepper, just to add some spice, even though the recipe doesn't call for it. So in order to make the soup, you want to cook the peppers first, which means broil them. And I know in the recipe, I say to broil them and then put them in a paper bag, but I'm going to show you a trick that I use, that I've learned to use. I take the peppers and I put them on a foil-lined tray, and then I put it in the broiler. And every 8 to 10 minutes, I turn them so that they get charred on all sides. And then when they're finished charring, all I do is enclose them in the pepper. And these are raw peppers, so they're going to take up much more room. When they're charred, they become very small. And instead of putting them in a bag, I just enclose them in foil and let them cool off a little, and then they're ready for peeling. So I've done that because you don't have to waste all the time waiting for them to be in the oven. And this one, I peeled these in advance. You can see there's a lot of liquid left over when you cook them in advance. Save that liquid. It's a delicious addition to the soup. Don't spill it out. And just for your purposes, I did one in a bag. And here's what it looks like when it's charred. You can see it's black. You don't have to get it that exact color. And the way you peel it is the skin comes right off. I usually use rubber or disposable gloves when I'm cooking, and my hands are going to get all messy now. So you can use those if you can find them these days, disposable gloves, and just peel the skin off. You'll notice the different colors in the pepper. Some of it's a little darker, that's okay. So when all the skin is peeled off, open the pepper. And you'll see there's seeds. You want to remove those seeds. All of this is easy to do with a cooked pepper. If you prefer, you can take the stem and the seeds out of the pepper when they're raw and then cook them skin side up, broiled, and let them char, and then put them in a bag or tin foil, and the skin will peel off too. I just find that takes me longer than this. So I put them in whole and roast them whole and do everything, the de-seeding, de-stemming, and chopping at once. So here we are with this pepper that I showed you and all of the peppers that I did yesterday. Now, some of the timing may be off because I'm using a butane cooktop, and that cooks a little more slowly than a regular cooktop. So don't fail me now. Here we go. So get a soup type pot. Let it get a little hot and pour in some olive oil. You don't really have to measure. I'm sure at this point of life, unless you're just started cooking, you know what 2 to 3 tablespoons of olive oil looks like. You want to get enough for a little bit more than a film at the bottom of your soup pot. And there aren't that many ingredients to this recipe. We have 1 onion, which is a small onion, about this size, 1 carrot, 1 celery. What you do is wash them, peel the onion, peel the carrot, just chop them up in a food processor. When your oil is a little hot, add the vegetables. In here, I also have some chopped up parsley. You could use any kind of parsley. If you don't have parsley, you don't want to buy parsley just for the soup, you can use celery greens from the celery that you used. It's a little bit of a different flavor, but it will be just fine. I hope everybody can see. This is what your vegetables look like. You want to chop these up into little pieces. You can use a food processor. So that was 2 tablespoons of oil, 1 small onion, 1 carrot, 1 stalk of celery, and a tablespoon of freshly minced parsley. Very often when you're cooking a soup or a stew, the recipe will tell you to use to cook the onion first. The reason for that is that it flavors the oil. Once it flavors the oil, everything else gets coated with the onion flavor. So it's always important, not essential, but it's better if you cook the onion and with the other vegetables first. If you're adding garlic, which you can also add to this, always add garlic later because garlic tends to burn if you cook it too much and you're going to get a rancid flavor. So I don't add garlic to this. Now we're going to add the peppers and I'm adding all of the juice. And just going to cut the peppers up a little for me to cook. You don't have to do this because it's going to be pureed later, but I think it's easier to puree if you have smaller vegetables. So here's your peppers. Onion, carrot, what have you. Vegetable stock. I couldn't get the vegetable stock that I like. I like a brand called Tabachnik. It's a kosher brand, but the reason I like it is because it's the mildest. I just wasn't able to get it, but this is pretty good brand, Kitchen Basics. Vegetable stock. Some of the vegetable stocks are more tomatoey and they're a little too strong for my tastes. This is 4 cups. And I have my own homemade 2 cups of vegetable stock that I had in the freezer. Vegetable stock freezes nicely, but not as long as things like chicken stock or vegetable stock, or beef stock. So I would give it maybe a month. So here we have the stock. It has to be brought to a boil. And I want to add some salt. Another thing is I never measure salt. I just add about what I think it's going to be. And we need some thickener for this. So I decided I'm going to use rice. We want about 1/3 of a cup of rice. I'm going to give you some alternatives in a minute. This is white rice. If you use brown rice, it's going to have to cook a lot longer. So I suggest white rice, long grain, jasmine, basmati, whatever you like. The reason that you use the rice is because it's a good thickener. And vegetable soup tends to be a little thin unless you're using a starchy vegetable or you thicken it with something like flour. I use flour as a thickener for stew sometime, for gravy, but I feel that in soup, the flour taste is a little off-putting. So I like to use a vegetable or a starch product like rice. The rice will cook in the soup. By the time it finishes simmering, the rice is done. And then when you puree it, you get the starchiness from the rice to make the soup thick. If you don't like rice, you don't have rice, you can add a medium all-purpose potato, by which I mean not a russet potato, not a baked potato, but like a Yukon Gold, a round potato. Use one sort of large round potato. And then we'll do the same thing. It'll thicken the soup. So this is it. There's really not much left to do except let this cook. And instead of you watching this cook, I'm going to put it on my stove. So just excuse me for a minute. I'm going to put this on the stove. And I set the timer, so we'll get back to the soup. And right now, I think I'm just going to put this away and get to dessert. So we'll come back to the soup after we finish dessert. I made a dessert yesterday, so you can see what the final product was like, and my husband was looking at it lovingly. I had to make sure that he didn't eat the dessert I was making. Anyway, the name apple streusel came about because I wanted to make apple strudel, and I had fond memories of my grandmother making her own strudel dough, stretching it across the counter. And I did that once, and that was enough for a lifetime. It was very good, but it was more work than was worth it. I used to be able to get authentic strudel dough at a Hungarian store in New York City, but they don't sell it anymore. And phyllo dough, which I use to make apple strudel and cheese strudel, really isn't exactly strudel dough. Strudel dough is stronger and thicker, has a different texture. So I wanted to make strudel, but I didn't want to make strudel dough and I couldn't get it. And so I did a play on words and decided to make apple streusel, which everybody knows that streusel is that sort of crumb crust on the top of fruit, coffee cake, stuff like that. And it was quite good. In reality, what we're talking about, after all, is apple crisp. Just happens to call it streusel because this is the kind of topping that you usually put on a pie or a coffee cake. And I added some oats because oats have a nice sweet flavor and it's a little milder than using something like granola, which is more crunchy, and all flour, which tends to be a little soggy sometimes. So let's talk about apples. Different times of year, I'm going to peel as we talk. These are Honeycrisp apples. At different times of year, you get different apples. In the fall, you get the most wonderful variety, and I like to make apple crisp, apple strudel, apple streusel, apple cake with something called a Rhode Island greenie, which is an old-fashioned apple that doesn't, it melts, but it doesn't fall apart. Can't get that except in October, so I have to make do with other apples. Certain apples are really not good for apple crisp, apple pie, apple streusel, because they fall apart. So things like an apple variety such as Macintosh, for example, which is terrific for applesauce, isn't good for an apple crisp. You need an apple that doesn't fall apart. It's soft, you want something that softens but doesn't fall apart. I know a lot of people use Granny Smith, which has a great flavor, but Granny Smith, unless you slice it very thin, sometimes doesn't soften enough for a really wonderful apple crisp. So the other thing I can say, in addition to the different kinds of texture of apple, is the flavor. Obviously, new apples, the kinds of varieties that apples that are on sale today tend to be very much sweeter than the old-fashioned apples that I remember from when I was a kid, which means if you're using an old-fashioned recipe that you got from your grandma or your mom, you want to use a little less sugar than they used to in the old days. Honeycrisp apples are sort of in between. They're sweet and they're crisp, but they also soften, and they're not as sweet as some of the other varieties. So you'll notice in this recipe, in the apple, it's streusel part itself, it's only 1/3 of a cup of sugar, and that's really not a lot when you compare it to some of the older recipes, which ask for much more. I also tend not to like things that are too sweet. If you make this recipe and you like something sweeter, by all means, add some more sugar. The other thing that you can add is raisins or dried cranberries or dried cherries or chopped up dried dates or apricots, any flavor that you would use or addition that you would use for an apple crisp. So once you peel the apples, and the reason I didn't do this ahead, I'm sure all of you know, apples tend to get yellow and brown if they sit around too long. And it really doesn't matter because we're putting cinnamon in this anyway. So it'll be brown because of the cinnamon. I also want to show you that these Honeycrisp apples tend to be a little small. I bought them in a bag. I don't do my own shopping yet. I haven't been out, and I have a shopper shop for me. And it was just easier to get the bag of Honeycrisp than to have somebody pick out some apples. So the recipe says 5 to 6. I'm going to use 6 because these are kind of small, even though Honeycrisps can be quite large. But like I mentioned with the pepper, use your judgment. One or more size apple that's medium or small or big is not going to make a huge difference. So, as I mentioned, you can also add whatever other ingredient that would normally go in an apple crisp. I'm just going to put this peel over here. And cut the apple. And have a lemon handy. You put lemon juice in an apple, on apple slices or pear slices. It'll prevent it from being too brown. And take the core with a knife and slice the slices into a bowl. If you want, you can use a food processor to slice. If you prefer a different texture, instead of slicing, you can chop the apples, which is what I did yesterday, because I wasn't looking at the recipe and I just chopped automatically until I realized I was supposed to slice the apples, but it doesn't matter. Just slice these apples. By the way, if you're making applesauce, Honey Crisps are good for applesauce too, and you don't have to peel. All you do is cut them in quarters like this, and just cook the apples until they're soft, and then you can always strain out the peel and the seeds and the core. So that's an easy way to make applesauce. I'm going to put some of this lemon in now so that the bottom layer of apples get some lemon juice. Mix that up with your hands. There was a cookbook author that was popular many, many years ago who said, my mother always told me not to use my hands when I cook, even though she instructed me to wash first. But she didn't like using hands. But most of the cookbook authors back in the day used to say, if you don't use your hands, you don't really have to feel for what you're cooking. So I learned to use my hands, and so far so good. So here we are. I can tell you also that this dessert freezes very well. So I'm making a whole recipe, but during these pandemic days, I don't have any company. I don't even see my children yet. So, cooking a whole recipe for 2 people can be, not good. We don't want to eat the same recipe 3-4 days in a row. So I make a whole recipe, but I put the apple, I put all the ingredients in a smaller pan, in a smaller baking dish, and freeze. This is enough for like 6 people, 4 to 6, depends how hungry you are. I put them in the freezer, and then I just take it out when I want to have this again for dessert. I'd say that it freezes well for up to 2 months. When you have anything with a crisp kind of top, like a streusel top, in order to not have it soggy when you unfreeze it, thaw it first. Let it come so that it's completely unfrozen, and then cook it in a preheated 375-degree oven, because streusel tops tend to get soggy, and that's one way to keep it as crisp as possible. So here we are. I've done 6 apples, all cut up. You don't want to see what's behind this camera here in terms of mess. And once again, little lemon juice. 1 large lemon will give you about 4 tablespoons of lemon juice. I just have to turn the heat down on the soup. So if you don't want to measure, this size lemon, I didn't measure. We want about 2 tablespoons of lemon juice for that amount of apples. And just squeeze that and it's about right. So mix that up. And we want some flour. We want a tablespoon of flour in order to keep the apples together, even though apples are not like peaches or berries that tend to get runny. You do need a little bit of flour in order to keep the apples together. So let's mix that in. And cinnamon, you want about 3/4 of a cup. I don't know where you get cinnamon, but I love Penzeys. They don't pay me. I'm not on, I don't get any money from them for touting them. But Penzeys, which has a store up in Norwalk, and you can do curbside pickup, they have excellent spices. So notice that I'm mixing things individually. The flour, the dry ingredients mix better if you mix them individually. Now 3 tablespoons of sugar, which for us is enough. As I said before, if you like things sweeter, by all means, add some more. Once you add sugar to apples, they start to soften. So if you're trying to cook ahead and you want to make the streusel top, or you're making an apple pie, you want to do the dough part first. We have less time here. We're going to do this all at once. But if you're home and you want to do things in part, do the top first, because once you put the sugar with the apples, they tend to deflate and they're going to get soggy. So apple, sugar, cinnamon, lemon. Let's put this aside while we make the streusel. Streusel you can also do by hand, but I have one of these little food processors. You can do it in a big food processor. I'll explain how you do this by hand if you want to do it by hand. For this streusel, you want 3/4 of a cup of flour, just all-purpose flour. Just put it all in the food processor. It's 1, 2, 3/4. And for the oats, I love Bob's Red Mill. Once again, they don't pay me. I'm not here for advertising. I'm just advising. These are really good oats. And they smell great. They're great for breakfast. So we want 1/4 of a cup of oats. I'm using whole grain oats rather than quick oats, just because I happen to have them, but any kind is fine. Quaker oats is fine, doesn't really matter. If you don't have oats, you can use an extra 1/4 of a cup of flour. Three tablespoons of sugar. So you see that the crust has some sugar as well. And just a little bit of salt. If you don't want to use the salt, that's fine. And some butter. 6 tablespoons of butter. When a recipe says butter in a cookbook or any kind of food blog, it means unsalted butter. If you use salted butter, first of all, salted butter doesn't have the fresh taste. The manufacturers put salt in butter in order to preserve it longer. So sweet butter, what they call sweet butter, which is unsalted, has a fresher taste. Cut the butter stick in half this way, and then in half this way. So you have 4 logs. And then cut sideways so that you wind up with little cubes and put them in here. If you don't want to use butter, margarine is fine. Make sure it's cold. I like Earth Balance Original. Has a nice flavor for non-butter butter. You can also use a combination of butter and or margarine and solid coconut oil. I wouldn't use all coconut oil because you get too much of a coconut flavor. Now, if I was doing this by hand in a bowl, I would mix it like this, keep going until all that butter was in little crumbles inside the flour mixture. But I have this wonderful machine. Mine's old, so it's a little hard to get the top on. But what I'm going to do is, I would suggest pulse. Whenever you're trying to put a solid fat into flour or some other flour-like mixture, you don't want to spin it so that it becomes a dough. You want to do it on a pulse or slowly with your fingers so that it's incorporated slowly. Oh, I have to plug it in. Like this. Note that my hand on top of this because I'm missing the insert. So you want to do this about 30 times. It's the way I make pie crust. And you'll see, always unplug before you put your hand inside the food processor, even if it's not on. And you can see a little butter crumbles. It's still very floury. I hope you can see how tiny these pieces of butter are. So this is your streusel mixture. As I said, I'm making it in 2, maybe 3 containers. You're going to see that I mound the onions. The reason I do that is because onions, as you know, deflate. And even though it looks like it's going to boil over, it won't. So we put half and half. And then put equal amounts of the streusel on top. And it'll get into the crevices. Don't worry if it's not even. Don't worry if some apple sticks out. This is a homey dessert. And this may seem like a lot of topping, but I assure you it's the right amount. When you make any kind of thing like cake or pie, always make sure your oven is preheated. So I preheated my oven and I'm just going to put these aside to bake. and show you the one I made yesterday, which I'm going to display for you after we finish the soup, which is about at its 25 minutes. So I'm going to bring it back and we'll finish up with the soup. So here we are with the soup that's been cooking for 25 minutes. And you could certainly eat it like this. You can put it in a food processor, but I have one of these handy immersion blenders. I think I've had this one for the last 30 years. I highly recommend this one too. And just puree the soup. You'll notice that the color of the soup is dark or light depending on how many yellow and orange peppers you use. This one tends to be darker than usual. It's very dark red pepper. When you're using an immersion blender, make sure you turn it off before you lift it up, and make sure you turn it on only when it's immersed. Otherwise, you're going to get splatter, and I can tell you that from experience. So this should be pretty pureed if you'd like. You can strain it. You don't have to. I have this nice little soup bowl. I don't know if you can see how thick this is, but it looks very inviting to me. By the way, if you like a cream soup, you can add a cup of cream to this recipe. It'll be much richer. And if you do that, then you could serve it as a cold soup over the summer. So this is good as hot soup, but a cream soup, usually is a little more appropriate in the summer. I'm going to get some parsley. This has all been cleaned. And just chop it up a little. By the way, another thing that I recommend highly, if you're looking to get some good knives, not necessarily recommending a brand, but most people will tell you to buy a chef's knife for chopping. I like this Santoku, which is about an inch shorter than a standard chef knife, and to me, it has the best weight and the best balance. I happen to like Wusthof, but there are many good brands. But it's a nice size, very versatile knife that you can use for everything. So here's my soup. Just going to put a little chopped parsley in it and the taste for you. It's good. I hope you make it. Okay, having that for dinner. So let's get back to our apple streusel. Once the apple streusel is in the oven, you want it to be lightly crispy and brown on top. It's time to serve. I didn't get a serving spoon. Be right back. So cut this, and you can see it's kind of crumbly. That's the way it's supposed to be. You can see that the apples are kind of not runny. They're not slimy. They're cooked properly. They're juicy. And if you want, you could put whipped cream, ice cream, sorbet. This is a homemade dessert, and you know, anything goes. So let me taste this. In our family, we always say, you know, I have to taste this to see if it's poison. That's good. By the way, I used cinnamon, but if you like things like ginger, nutmeg, add those.
Ronnie, thank you again for the wonderful class.
Thank you
Truly
for asking
enjoyed
me.
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.